Okay, let's start building out our register and broadcast node endpoint. So what this endpoint will do is it will register the new node with itself, and then it will broadcast the new node to all the other nodes that are already present in our network. So let's build it out. So we already have this line where we define a variable called new node URL, and this new node URL data will be passed in on the request body, similar to how we have transaction data being passed into our transaction endpoint. So now we have access to the new node URL, and the first thing that we want to do with this new node URL is register it with this node. And all we have to do to register it with this node is put it inside of our network nodes array on our blockchain data structure. So to do that, we will simply say bitcoin.networknodes.push the new node URL. Cool. So now we are pushing the new network node URL into our network nodes array. Great. And we only want to do this if this new URL isn't already present in our array. So we're going to say if bitcoin.networknodes.index of the new node URL equals -1, then we're going to push the new URL into the array. So basically all this line is saying is that if this new node URL is not already present in our network nodes array, then add it to the array. Cool. So now the new node URL is registered with this network node. Next, we have to broadcast this new node URL to all the other nodes inside of the network. So in order to do that, let's delete this. And to make this broadcast, we are going to say bitcoin.networknodes.for each network node URL, because every network node is only stored as a URL inside of our network nodes array. So for every network node inside of our network nodes array, we are going to want to hit the register node endpoint. Okay. Cool. So just one more time, basically all we're doing is saying for each network node that is already present in the network, or for every network node that is already in this array inside of our network nodes array, we want to register our new node URL with each of these network nodes by hitting the register node endpoint. So how are we going to do this? Well, in order to do this, we're going to have to make a request to a different node. We're going to have to make a request to every single node at this endpoint. So how are we going to make a request? Well, we're going to have to import a new library. So let's head over to the terminal, and we'll cancel out of our first network node, and we will say npm install request promise --save. This request promise library will allow us to make requests to all the other nodes in our network. And we'll install that. Cool. Now we have to remember to restart our first node. So we will say npm run node 1. Cool. Good. So back in our file, at the top of our file, we are going to import the library that we just downloaded. So we're going to say const rp, which stands for request promise, equals require request promise. Cool. Now let's use this library. Okay, so here we are back on our register and broadcast node endpoint. And we have to broadcast our new node to all the other nodes in our network. So let's do that now. And we're going to use the request promise library that we just imported. Now, the next couple of steps might be a little bit confusing as we're going through it, but don't worry. Right after we finish coding it out, I'm going to walk you through it step by step to make sure everything makes sense. So the first thing that we want to do for our request promise library is define some options that we're going to use. So we will say const request options equals an object. And inside of this object, we have to define the options that we want to use for each request. So the first option we want to define is what URI do we want to hit, or what URL do we want to hit. And we know that we want to hit the register node endpoint on all of our other network node URLs. So we will simply say network node URL, which is this variable right here, plus / register node. Cool. Next, we want to define the method that we want to use. And to hit this endpoint, we want to use the post method. So we will say method post. Next, we want to define what data we're going to pass along with this request. So we're going to say body, and inside of the body is where we define the data. So we're going to say new node URL is the new node URL. And finally, we're going to set the JSON option to true so that we send it as JSON data. Cool. So these are the options that we want to use for each request we make. Now let's use these options. So we're going to say RP, which is request promise, these options. And this request is going to return to us a promise. And we want to get all of these promises back in a single array. So what we're going to do is up here, we're going to define an array of promises. So we'll say const register nodes promises equals an empty array. And then we're simply going to say register nodes promises dot push in this request. Cool. So that's all we want to do inside of our for each loop. Then outside of this loop, we want to run all of these promises. So we will say promise.all our register node promises. Then, with the data that we get back from these promises, we want to use the data. Okay, let's pause here and run through what just happened, because this can be a little bit confusing. What we are doing is cycling through all of the nodes that are already inside of our network. And then we are using these options to make a request to each one. These requests that we make are just going to register the new node with each node in the network. And all of these requests are going to be asynchronous, which means we don't know how long it's going to calculate this data, because we are trying to reach an outside source, which is the other nodes in our network. So because we don't know how long it's going to take to get this data back, we're going to put all of these requests inside of this array. So for example, if we currently have 5 nodes in our network, we're going to make 5 requests, and we're going to push them all inside of this array. Then, when we run this line, promise.all, all of our requests, it's going to run every single request in here. Then, when all of those requests are finished, we can use whatever data we got back from them. So basically, long story short, all we're doing is registering this new node with every node inside of our network. And then when that runs and all of it is complete, we can do some other operation inside of here. Cool. So at this point, inside of our register and broadcast node endpoint, we have registered the new node with this current node by pushing it into our list. And we have also broadcast the new node to all the other nodes in our network. In the next video, we will pick up here after our broadcast is completed and finish up this endpoint. And at this point, I just want to mention that I understand this is pretty confusing what we're going through right now, and it might not make a lot of sense to you, but once we build out this entire endpoint and our register node endpoint and our register node's bulk endpoint, we are going to test them all and we're going to explore how they all work together, and all of this code will become a lot more clear to you. So hang in there, and I'll see you in the next video.